Hello, it's 4 o'clock Eastern Time. My name is John Bell from the Ballard Institute and Museum of Puppetry, and my colleague Elise Van Ness, a talented student in the Puppet Arts program who's doing all the tech. We're here with Steve Tillis, who's out in California. Hi, Steve. And we're really happy to present to you our online puppet forum number 9, The Aesthetics of the Puppet with Steve Tillis. And that's really, really exciting. I got to talk with Steve a little bit yesterday, had a wonderful conversation, and look forward to continuing that today with some video clips of interesting aspects of puppet theater. This forum today is part of a whole series of online puppet forums we're doing this summer to take advantage of the, I guess, unfortunate situation we all find ourselves in, and to reach out through the magic of the interwebs to talk with scholars and puppeteers about puppetry. And for those of us who are kind of geekily involved with teaching or thinking about puppets, trying to look at different ways of approaching puppetry, and Steve's made real important contributions to puppetry studies, especially with his 1992 book Toward an Aesthetics of the Puppet, which we want to talk about, as well as other aspects of his work. So I wanted to say that Elise, throughout this event today, will be posting things online. And I wanted to let you know that we are offering other aspects of our online programming this summer. Elise herself is going to be doing one of our puppet workshops tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, which is about, what's the title? But cooking. It's a cooking show with food and puppets, which is going to be awesome. Check that out. And we'll talk more about that later. Also, we're making our current online programming free and accessible online. And if you'd like to support this event and other events and our workshops and performances, which are going to continue into the fall with a puppet slam and fall puppet forums and more workshops, please make a contribution to the page, to the URL that I'm sure that Elise just threw up on or placed on our Facebook page. So just thinking about the workshops, because they're so interesting. Tomorrow, Friday, Elise is going to do edible puppets. Next Wednesday, No Puppets Allowed workshop with another talented puppet art student, Felicia Cooper. So it's puppets without puppets. And then on Friday, October 7th, Felicia and Elise are going to do a special kind of call-in conversation show, Ask a Puppeteer. So you can ask a puppeteer all of the questions you ever wanted to ask a puppeteer. Steve Tillis, who's sitting in his study with his pipe, let's see, he began his career in puppet theater with Dr. Edison's Traveling Medicine Show, Sole Purveyors of Dr. Edison's Electric Elixir, The Great Melancholia Remedy, which probably we could use right now. We had a meeting with a puppet arts program with Bart Rocco Burton, who mentioned to me that you were a member of Pandemonium Puppet Company, which I didn't, pardon?
For 2 years.
For 3 years?
2 years.
And 2 years, Bart said you were a great writer. And he said that when you would go off to do a show, you'd hop in the van and he'd say, Steve, tell me a story. And that you would tell a story that would last the entire length of the trip until you pulled into the parking lot of the venue where you were going to play. So he said, Steve's a great storyteller. So I thought that was really nice. I never knew
The hard
that.
part was timing it so that the story ended when we pulled up.
Right.
That was the trick.
I'm sure. So over the years, Steve has worked with numerous puppet companies and found himself singing opera in Humperdinck's Hansel and Gretel, dancing ballet in Ravel's L'Enfant et les Sortilèges. And he received his PhD in dramatic arts from University of California, Berkeley. And as I mentioned earlier, is the author of Toward an Aesthetics of the Puppet, but also a book entitled Rethinking Folk Drama, which to my mind is always related to puppetry in some ways, and numerous articles about puppetry, world theater history, folk theater, performing, writing, and directing, acting. He has a new book coming out, The Challenge of World Theater History. I looked on JSTOR and saw some of your articles about world theater, which is a really interesting subject because traditionally Western theater professors had a really difficult time dealing with theater that wasn't from Western Europe and North America. And so this necessary task, this necessary work or excitement of thinking about world theater is something that you've been thinking about. And that, of course, in my mind, that involves of necessity a lot of puppets. Steve teaches at the School of Liberal Arts at St. Mary's College of California. And I recalled that years ago in the previous century, when I was the guest editor of an issue of the Drama Review about puppets, masks, and performing objects that later became a separate book, Steve contributed an essay, The Art of Puppetry in the Age of Media Production. There it is, with Theodore Skipetaris image on the front. The Age of Puppetry and the Art of Media Production, which is sort of based on or connected to Walter Benjamin's famous essay about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. But it's sort of like extended some of the ideas that you were pursuing in the aesthetics of the puppet into the realm of digital or media production, which is interesting. So how did you become interested in puppetry, Steve?
Well, I wasn't. I never saw a puppet show as a kid, and I probably saw Kukla, Fred, and Ollie a couple times on TV as a kid, but thought they were boring.
Right.
This was before the Muppets when I was a kid, so I didn't have that opportunity. When I was in high school, for some reason, one of my teachers decided to create a puppet show to perform for the local elementary schools. I had no interest in it, and so I wasn't part of it. But about a week before the show was supposed to go up, one of the actors, one of the puppeteers got sick or dropped out or for some reason had to be replaced. And this teacher asked me if I would do it. So I said, sure. And I operated two really, really ugly puppets, one on each hand, called Manny and Puke Face for some reason.
Okay, this is a kid's show?
It was a kid's show. I don't know that the names were actually used on stage.
Right.
That was what they were called.
Right.
And I thought, well, this is kind of fun. And it seemed something that I could do pretty easily.
Right.
And then a few years later, this same teacher, well, me and a couple friends had become friendly with this teacher, out of school.
Where is this, by the way? Is this in California?
This was in New Jersey.
New Jersey, aha. Okay.
This was in New Jersey.
Is that the Bart Rocco Burton connection? He's also from New Jersey?
Nope, I met Bart when we were in Connecticut. But the teacher, we were sitting around one day, probably our minds a bit altered. And one of my friends said, I'd love to start a circus. And we thought about that for a while and the way one thinks about these things when one's mind is altered. And my former teacher, a guy named Toby Grace, said, well, what I want to do is start a medicine show.
Great.
And so we did. We built a medicine wagon and wrote a show. Mostly it was vaudeville stuff, but he decided to use puppets for a lot of the performing.
Right.
And I was also the clown of the company. And we sold Dr. Edison's electric elixir, the great melancholia remedy, the
Right.
only sure cure for melancholia, scrophilia, dyspepsia, spavins, warts, baldness, quartane, quinsy, mandora foot, ague, female disorders, any little disease you happen to have. Drink a bottle. It'll make you sick, but drink a second and you'll be cured.
That's great.
Yeah, I heard that it's lately been tested, proven effective for
Oh,
COVID-19
I'm sure. I'm sure.
and hemorrhoids
Right.
and hangnails.
It sounds like you need to let the president know about this.
Yeah, well, it's about as good as the stuff that he wants to peddle. So,
Were you doing puppets as part of this too? Were you?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
What kind of puppets?
it was Muppet style puppets
Okay.
because by that point the Muppets were out, and Toby, it was the only type of puppet he knew how to use. Um, and they were awful puppets. They were ridiculously heavy, very top heavy, because most of them had hats or all sorts of frou-frou on top of their heads. And so everyone was operating them like this, you know, like they were talking up to the sky.
Right.
And I realized, you know, the lip sync came pretty naturally to me. But I realized that the most important thing with the puppet was to keep eye focus.
Right.
You know,
Sure.
because people keep eye focus. And if the puppet's just staring up in space, then the puppet's not going to be believable.
Right.
But if the puppet keeps eye focus, it creates a sense of reality.
Did you come to that realization yourself, or were you sort of inventing this as you went along, or had you been in touch with other puppeteers who were sharing information?
I'm sure this had been invented a million times before, but I realized it for myself.
Yeah.
I got to realize I'd never seen a puppet show.
Right.
I had no idea about puppets, except, you know, at that point I'd seen the Muppets once or twice, but I knew nothing about puppetry.
And was there something about the form that intrigued you? Like, hey, I like working with puppets.
What intrigued me was the fact that this was the form that the company was going to be using.
Right.
Because Toby was fascinated by puppets.
Right.
And so that's what I did.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, and then was this before a prelude to working with Bart Roccoburton's Pandemonium Puppet Company, or did you begin your academic career before?
No, I didn't. We did this during the, we played at carnivals and county fairs.
Right.
Through the Northeast, all the way out to Ohio.
Great.
And we'd set up and we'd play for a week with the fair, and then we'd move on to the next fair.
Okay. Is this like what decade is this?
Well, this is the 70s. This is the mid 70s.
All right. Great time for traveling puppet shows.
It was a great time for all sorts of stupidity.
Yeah.
Which we engaged in as liberally as we could.
Okay.
There's no other way to put it. And it was insane. I imagine that, I mean, you worked with Bread and Puppet when they were younger. I imagine they were always better organized than this show was.
I don't know, but yeah. Yeah, Peter Schumann, last week he was in an online interview. He said, we specialize in doing bad puppet shows. So
yeah, well,
a time of great possibility. So, and then so you worked for 2 years with Pandemonium.
Well, after the medicine show folded, I traveled for a while. Then I worked with the Puppet Place in Chicago. The late Ray Nelson.
All right.
Was the director. I worked there for a few years. Then I worked for Bob Brown's Puppets.
In LA?
In Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay. Right. Washington, D.C. Got it. Yes.
And it was with the Puppet Place that I sang opera.
Great. Puppet opera. That's classic.
And it was, well, yeah, it was for the full orchestra. It was the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, players from the Symphony Orchestra. And I don't recall if George Schulte was conducting, but his wife was narrating. And it was a big show. And then in DC, it was an even bigger show. It was with Bob Brown, where we
Right.
did L'Enfant de le Sortilège. It was translated as The Enchanted Child.
Right.
And
I
we
think
had the
with,
whole national, it was the National Symphony Orchestra playing behind us, and we were in the Kennedy Center on one of the main stages.
oh, okay.
It
And
was a
I
huge
mean, that's a
production.
major company in the Washington area. I think, as I understand it, you mostly using marionettes. Is that right?
Yeah, it was mostly marionettes. And
Wow.
after I went from him, I went to Ken Moses, Pickwick Puppets.
Sure. Okay.
Um, and it was very funny. The first couple of days I was there, I was moving the puppets in the same way that we moved them with Bob Brown.
Right.
And he said, cut that crap. I don't want puppets jiggling around. I want very, very strict and careful, which shows you, there's huge stylistic difference, even if you're working the same type of puppet.
Sure.
And people who work with puppets know this. But
Right.
people on the outside think a marionette's a marionette. They don't
Right.
realize
Right.
that there are stylistic differences in the way you control them.
Sure.
Anyway,
Right.
I worked with Bart with Pandemonium Puppets in Connecticut for a few years. Then I worked for Ken Moses again for a bit. And then my wife and I decided we didn't like winter anymore and we were going to move to California.
Okay.
And after I came out here, I thought there'd be loads of puppet troops, but there really aren't that many. And they weren't doing the sort of touring shows that I'd been making a living at. And because I didn't really know anybody, I decided to go back to school and get a degree in theater.
Okay. Great.
Um, so that's how my academic career began,
Right.
mostly because it was something to do.
Right. And then like my experience in higher education, especially in graduate school, was and coming to that with an interest in puppet theater was recognizing the dearth of information and also more or less interest, in that world. Like I had to, at that point I knew I wanted to do it. So I had to push, and it was sort of, what is it like? I don't know. It would be like if you were in ballet school, but you were interested in tap dancing, or I don't know, that's not a good analogy, but it was sort of like, okay, that's okay, great. You're interested in that weird, unusual, not very important type of theater. But what was your experience in the academic theater world and your previous experience with puppetry? Did you have a hard time connecting those two?
Well, I said I went to school because I didn't know anybody, but it was also because I realized I didn't know anything.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I'd been performing either live or with puppets for, I don't know, more than a decade, 15 years, but I knew nothing about history of theater, nothing at all. I knew nothing. I had not read many plays. When I was an undergraduate, they didn't have a theater department where I was. I acted in plays,
Right.
no actual learning going on.
Right.
And so I had this, I knew nothing about theater, and I wanted to learn something about what I had been doing.
Right.
The program I went into for a master's degree at San Jose State was just a general theater, program.
Right.
But when it came time to start thinking about writing a master's thesis, and I took the regular classes in Greeks through contemporary and all that usual stuff.
Right.
When it came time to write a thesis, my advisor said, well, do you have any ideas? And one of the ideas was writing a history of theater in the gold country out here in California.
Great.
I was fascinated by the gold country.
Right.
And he says, well, is there anything you actually know anything about? And I said, well, I actually know a bit about puppets, and it would be interesting, I think, to try and understand puppets in a way, a theoretical way, I guess, that hasn't really been developed.
Right.
This just before Yurkovsky's book on the science system of puppet came out.
Right.
And he said, okay, do that one, write on puppets. And I knew as I started writing that it was going to be not just, the 50 to 80 page dissertation, master's thesis, that I wanted to write something book length.
Right.
And so that became the book, Toward an Aesthetics of the Puppet.
To me, it's really interesting. And also looking over that book in the past few days, from the early 90s, it's interesting because you realize there wasn't so much material or not so much written about puppetry at that time. It makes me think that in the past, what year is it, 2020, the past 20 or 30 years, there's actually been quite a bit more written about puppetry. But at the time you're writing that, the aesthetics of the puppet, we've had like the French writer Charles Magnin in the middle 19th century writing a book, and these are all folks that you refer to in your study. The Prague Linguistic School, Bogatyrev and other folks, Henryk Yurkowski, or Yurkovsky, as Penny Francis said.
I just followed her pronunciation. I don't know how the hell it's pronounced.
Yeah, I guess she's right. I mean,
right.
It was interesting to talk with her about working with Yurkovsky a couple of weeks ago. And then, it's a time where we have Paul McFarlane and Marjorie Batchelder, which were pretty much the only sort of semi-serious history books about American puppetry, and Bill Baird, whose book has been quite popular, but it's not really a
it's not deep. There's also Michael Malkin's book.
Malkin, right,
was available to me at the time, which was very useful. And
looking at
I was just looking at my puppet shelf.
Your pile of puppet books.
There's a few other things, but it was pretty slim, I think, what I had access to.
Right.
And it was made slimmer by the fact that this was back before you could go online and search every library.
Right.
I mean, if I didn't see a reference to something somewhere, I couldn't get the book. And so there's probably a fair amount of stuff that I missed, which I would find now because I just didn't have access to, the internet.
Right.
It didn't exist when I wrote this.
Right.
And I think that's one of the problems with the book is that it's it's relatively thinly sourced. If I were writing it now, I'd want like twice as many things in the bibliography.
Yeah. And I think part of what I'm thinking is that, in fact, there weren't so many sources,
there wasn't much.
if you were writing a work about Shakespeare or Renaissance drama or Ibsen or Chekhov, you'd be full. There'd be tons and tons of articles and books you could look on. But with puppetry, despite the fact that it's being an ancient worldwide form of popular performance, that at that time there wasn't so much to draw on.
Now, if I had access to everything that had been written in German and in French and in Japanese,
sure.
But I mean, that's another of the problems. I'm monolingual, and so it wasn't. I couldn't do the research in other languages that might have been useful.
Well, and that's one of the interesting things about puppetry, of course, is that kind of by definition, you're stepping into global traditions and global performance forms. And one of the nice things about the aesthetics of the puppet is that you're fully embracing that challenge. And it's kind of interesting to look at that because you're not just thinking about Punch and Judy or European forms. But stepping back a little bit, thinking of I want to say novelty, but of addressing this subject of the aesthetics of the puppet, what is that? And, how did you develop your sense of the aesthetics of the puppet? And let me note that one of our viewers, Mirza Hosseini Fahime, maybe I'm thinking might be from Iran, not sure, says, "Hi, I'm really happy to see Steve. I use your book in university." And when we were talking yesterday, you mentioned that this book had been translated into, I guess, to Farsi for use in Iran. So it's had a worldwide influence, which is super awesome. But can you talk about how you developed what you were going to do in thinking about the aesthetics of the puppet?
Well, the book is titled Toward an Aesthetics of the Puppet.
Toward.
Okay. And the toward is actually very important because the basic idea behind the toward is that we're not really prepared to write a full aesthetics of the puppet without having a better sense of what the puppet is in the first place and why it has such a universal appeal. Whatever the other things that might be appealing about puppetry, the scripts, the characterizations, the costuming, whatever, something about puppets per se, puppets qua puppets, is appealing to people. And my thought was, until I tried to figure that out, it would be impossible to make a more general argument about aesthetics. And so that's the first part of the book, is trying to figure out what is a puppet and why does it have the appeal that it does, regardless of its manifestations.
So how did you do that? How did you decide to approach that? What were you looking? I'm trying to draw up like your table of contents. I mean, you go through definitions of the puppet and explanations of this three-part arrangement of the artist, the puppet, and the audience. And then you get into I think a key element of your book, double vision, which is super fascinating to talk about, and which we want to talk about more. Let's see. I'm looking at Carol Sterling's message. Okay, but maybe maybe we could get to Carol's question in a second. But excuse me for interrupting you all the time, Steve. But
you haven't interrupted me yet.
So okay, so tell us about your developing. Here's the thing I've been thinking about as I review your book. Sometimes we think of the aesthetics as kind of, a rarefied question, what are the aesthetics, and although it's a quite practical question, and one of the challenges in terms of puppetry is that, and an interesting challenge is that your aesthetics needs to be something that could be applied to American puppet theater, European puppet theater, African puppet theaters, Asian puppet theater, and China, Japan, Indonesia. Like it's a global format. Yeah. And how do you develop an aesthetics for a technique art form that has so many strong global contexts?
I mean, can you look at a Punch and Judy show on the one hand and a Bunraku show on the other hand, right, and talk about them with the same aesthetic language?
Right.
Is a real and important question. For my mind, like I'm saying, I was looking at the step before that.
Okay.
At what is there a universality to anything in puppets?
Right.
uh, that would work for describing any kind of puppetry.
Right.
So I was trying to establish like a baseline idea
Right.
from which one could develop a full aesthetics as a
Okay.
start point. Now, I've never tried to develop a full aesthetics of the puppet, and I wouldn't really know how to. I don't know enough about aesthetic theory really to even try. But the preliminary stuff that I was actually working on, I remember I ran across a guy, I think it was from the Prague School, Otakar Zich.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you know, it was pretty obscure stuff.
I'm big Otakar Zich fan right here.
Oh, well, that's sick. And he had a passage. When we look at the puppet, we see the puppet as either a monstrous thing. I don't remember the exact passage. I'm not going to look it up. As either a monstrous thing that's alive,
Right.
or as, you know, an object, a toy.
Right.
But it was an either or.
Right.
In the way he wrote it. And it depended, I think, largely on the size of the puppet in his view.
Okay.
I remember sitting in my room reading that and trying to decide which it was.
Right.
And then one day I realized, hey, wait a second, why can't it be both?
Right.
When we look at a puppet, we see an object.
Right.
Any puppet, doesn't matter, all right? Whether it's Punch and Judy or a Bunraku puppet or, you know, some sort of object that's being used as a puppet, we see an object. But we imagine that it's alive.
Right.
At the same time. I mean,
right.
Punch and Judy is just a couple of rags, you know, beating the crap out of each other.
Right.
But we're able to imagine, because of the way the puppet looks, because of the way the puppet moves, because of the speech given to the puppet, we're encouraged to imagine that it has life.
Right.
Even as we see that it's an object. And so this is the idea of double vision.
Mm-hmm.
We see an object, we imagine life at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And my argument was that that is an ontological paradox. Ontological meaning the study of being.
Right.
Right. And what is this thing in front of us? Is it
Right.
alive? Is it an object? How can it be both?
Right.
And so it teases us. This paradox teases us.
Right.
It draws us in as we try to figure out what we're seeing. That's the idea of double vision.
I know I wonder if you want to think about, a good way to think about this would be to share some of the video clips you've suggested. Like, is that a way to get into this more?
Not quite yet.
Okay, good.
Actually, let me lead into one of them.
Very good.
This idea that the puppet is both imagined alive and seen as an object,
right,
is something that takes place in the audience's imagination. Right? It's not the puppet itself that is these things. It's the audience's imagining.
Right.
The audience's viewing of the puppet that makes these things happen.
Yeah.
And so one of the implications of what I wrote is that puppetry only exists in the process of performance, right, in front of an audience.
Right.
If you look at a Punch and Judy puppet and it's laying on the floor, it's
right.
just an object. It's not a puppet.
Yeah, yeah.
We're willing to call it a puppet, but
right.
it's not actually a puppet because there's no double vision happening. It's just a doll.
This is a challenge we face with our puppet museum, where we're
Yeah, yeah.
They're not lying on the floor, but they're, you know, they're not moving so much. So it's a big challenge.
Yeah, one of the things I think that public museums might want to do is, uh, sure, you have the physical display of the puppet, but there should always be, if possible, some video of how it
Yeah,
moves, of how
we
it
do
works in
that.
performance. But anyway, the implication of the audience's involvement is that the audience is the co-creator
Right.
of the puppet, right? It's the audience's imagination
Right.
that makes the puppet possible.
It's like they have to complete the circle or something.
Yeah. And like Elise, if you could throw on the Le Petit Bonhomme,
Great.
okay, that might illustrate what we're talking about.
Is this the Philippe Gentil?
No,
No.
no.
Sorry.
This is, we'll see if she, yeah, this is the one. And keep the sound audible, please, but not totally down. Okay.
Thanks, Elise. Uh, it's a nice puppet.
We're looking at two pieces of foam rubber glued together and the ball stuck on top.
Right.
If it were laying around in the house, you'd think it was garbage and throw it out.
Right.
But it's able to create a living personality, and I think a very strong personality,
Right.
because the way it's moved, is sufficient to give it, to allow us to imagine it has life.
Right.
We are, as the audience, in other words, we are creating this puppet by imagining the life in it.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's the point I was getting at. And so
maybe we should thank you, Elise. Maybe
yeah,
should we? Okay.
that's enough. And so it doesn't have a face.
Right.
But we can imagine a face.
Right.
It doesn't even have legs. It just has that one strip down the middle.
Right.
We can see it walking.
Right.
Right. It doesn't have hands, but we can see it gripping.
Right.
All this is a function of our imagination,
right.
as the audience. we're filling in the signs that the puppet doesn't actually have.
Right. Right.
And so one of the reasons I find puppetry exciting is how much it actively involves the audience
Right.
in making the show happen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Super, super, super exciting, super important, and also so straightforward and simple too.
Mm-hmm. And it's
Yeah.
nicely manipulated.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful manipulation. I thought of there's some interesting comments and questions coming in that I think we could deal with down the line a bit. But James Beauregard Ashby says, building on the idea of double vision, do you think that every puppet show, regardless of the intended content, is a meditation on what life and death are, like a zombie or Lazarus Jesus, etc.? What do you think of that?
A meditation on what life and death are. Well, it sounds very serious.
Yeah.
I think arguably that's implicit, although usually pretty suppressed. I mean, in that little piece we just saw, I wasn't thinking too much about life and death.
Right.
But I think you could make an argument that it's implicit in puppetry because you have something that's not alive that you're imagining is alive.
Right.
And I know that the death of puppets
Right.
can be really important. I remember when I was with Ken Moses, we were doing a show called Don Quixote.
Right.
I don't remember what the title was, but it was about Don Quixote, and used puppets of different scales. Some were, 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. Some were 6, 7 feet tall.
Right.
And when Don Quixote dies, it's with the large 7-foot puppet, and he slowly crumples up and drops to the ground. And the puppeteer, who's masked but visible behind him, slowly steps away. And every time we did that, the audience gasped.
Huh. Right.
Because, as one of them told me later, it was like the puppeteer was the soul of the puppet.
Right.
And seeing the puppeteer pull away,
right,
made the death all the more visible.
Yeah.
And so I think you can consciously play on puppets
Right.
even without the puppet dying, as in that case, you can
Right.
play on the idea of puppets as life and death. I think that's certainly something you could go to if you wanted to.
It's sort of implied, or you're sort of right there with that, which I think is why puppets often are so connected with ritual and religion and in other cultures. Mm-hmm. But you're sort of at the cusp there of life and death, so I wonder if, do you want to look at some of these other clips in terms of some of the ideas you're articulating towards the aesthetics of the puppet, or is it about just the way you develop to describe puppets, or the vocabulary we use to describe puppets?
All right. Well, how do we describe puppets? We usually speak in terms of marionette, rod puppet, shadow puppet, a few others, right? And it struck me that vocabulary is pretty is limited. It doesn't say enough about what we're seeing. So everybody who's watching this knows what the traditional European and American marionette looks like. It's 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet tall, whatever. It's strings on top, going up to a controller of one sort or another. But I want to show clips of a couple different things that technically, I suppose, you'd have to call marionettes, but
right.
They're so different. So, Elise, if you could put up the Opera de Pupi.
Okay.
I can't pronounce it.
Sicilian Marionette Theater.
Sicilian Marionette.
Good. Very good. Thank you, Elise.
And keep the sound pretty low. Okay, that's good.
Il mio seguito siete quella che gode di più della mia stima, della mia fiducia e della mia ammirazione.
So as you can see straight away, we're dealing with rods, not strings.
Right.
There is one string.
Madre di Orlando.
We've also got an offstage, a separate speaker who does all the male roles, and then a woman who does all the female roles. But if you look closely at the king who's swinging his arm around, his left arm has a string control. So you've got controls, one rod and one string for the two arms, and then you've got the rod coming down into the head. And as we'll see in a shorter, slightly later clip, the rod coming down into the head is actually cleverly contrived, so the head becomes removable if you want it to be. But these have very little to do with marionettes. If you see the way he's moving, essentially the only way to motivate these is to swing them, roll them back and forth, which kicks out one leg and then the other. Back, and it does the same thing in reverse. In regular marionettes, it's enough to make it look like they're walking. This is extremely hard, and most of the puppets are just swung around. And so to say, well, these are marionettes, might set up in somebody's mind that, oh, strings and delicate movement, but these are anything but delicate movement.
Right. Should we pause the video now for?
Yeah, Elise, if you could run up to 2750. Excuse me, yeah, 2750, that would be splendid.
So there's marionettes and there's marionettes.
It's marionettes and marionettes, but the highlight of all of these shows is the fight scenes, where again, you're seeing the puppets mostly just float around in each other. There's a head coming off. There's drums, the sound of clashing is a central part of the metal clashing, the metal costume. Throw it down. One of these puppets will have his head split open. One of the puppets on the right will have his head split open at once. Notice that the swords, when they're fighting, the shields, when they're fighting, are kept in a very upright position, a very unrealistic position, because that's the only way you can get the sword to hit the shields. Throw them around. And you can see that operating these sort of puppets is a real physical work.
Right.
Okay, Elise, thank you. That's enough.
I'm thinking maybe, Elise, maybe you could share the URLs of these clips so people could watch them at their leisure if they'd like to. But so,
but before you do that, Elise, I want to show one more marionette.
Very good.
Go to see Odyssey, please, Elise. And this is a marionette that you need, and play, please. You need a crane to operate. If you notice, the right and left of the puppet, the eyes move and the head moves. Extremely articulated, the mouth moves also. Notice the right and left of the puppet, heading those guys swinging down on ropes. That's how the legs are moving.
I think, Elise, I think you need to turn down the video volume a bit more. I couldn't hear what Steve was saying.
I'll say it again. You see these guys that are swinging down on the ropes. Those are how the legs are operating. But it takes a full crane to hold up the puppet, and electronical controls that go up that will go into the that will work the head as well. And so, I mean, it's a marionette. It's hanging off of the ropes, but it's unlike any other sort of marionette.
Right.
Now, okay, thank you, Elise. Oh, Elise, if you could run to 250, I would appreciate it.
Maybe I think you could bring the volume on the video even a little bit lower.
Yeah, you can kill all the volume.
Yeah.
So here's another one of their marionettes. It's a dog. Notice how carefully articulated it is.
Right.
It's a beautiful puppet, and it doesn't require as big a machine. And this one, I guess you would call a rod puppet also, a rod and marionette.
Right.
A rod because of the main support to its tail, to its hindquarters. And here's the third marionette in this show, the third puppet in this show. And again, this is operated from above primarily, although in this case, you can see the people pulling on those ropes are operating the legs through a pulley system, and each guy pulls twice and then hands over the rope to the next guy,
Right.
presumably because it's hard work.
Right.
Okay, Elise, thank you.
And this, of course, is the French company Royal Deluxe, who's been doing these giant, as you can see, kind of environmental shows in cities all over the world. So amazing work. And
there are scores and scores of videos on YouTube of their work. And so all you have to do is type in giant puppet, really, and you'll see it. Now, you work with really big puppets with Bread and Puppet, didn't you, John?
Right. Yeah, but
how big did they get?
Well, some of the big ones they use now, like the head is like 25 feet tall, and the body is 100 feet long. But Bread and Puppet doesn't use that giant marionette technique that Royal Deluxe does. So
that's what I was going to ask. How are they operated?
Yeah,
how do they operate it with Bread and Puppet? With
rods, basically, usually from underneath, or this giant Mother Earth puppet I'm thinking about. The head is mounted on some wheels, a wheel and axle system, and then the giant hands, it's like direct manipulation, a lot of people holding them. So it's giant puppets, but they're not marionettes like Royal Deluxe.
Right, but this is my point. If we were to call them rod puppets,
right,
that would be pretty misleading.
Right.
And in the vocabulary that's generally used, any puppet that's operated hands-on, well, most of them are called bunraku style puppets.
Right.
But that's also a totally inadequate way of describing them.
So what's the better way to describe these different forms then?
Well, I don't know that there's a single better way, but what I tried to do was develop a more fully articulated descriptive vocabulary.
Okay.
For using with puppets. And I talked about the control mechanism, how you actually use control. So in the case of the Sicilian marionettes, the mechanism is the poles and the string. I talk about the control points. Where does the control actually hit the puppet?
Right.
So with the Sicilian marionettes, one of the critical things about it is there's no control over the legs.
Exactly.
There are no control points in the legs. The legs can merely swing.
Right.
Which is very different from from most standard marionettes.
Right.
And the third thing is the articulation points in the puppet.
Right.
Where can the puppet actually bend?
Right.
The Sicilian marionettes, they can turn their heads. They can't nod their heads, but they can turn their heads.
Right.
They can bow down. But there's no articulation points on the legs at all. And there's no articulation points on the arms. All the arms can do is swing. All the legs can do is swing. And so for a more careful description of this, and obviously it's not as quick as to say, oh, it's a marionette, but I would note it's got a particular control mechanism of the rods and the string, that it's got particular control points only in the head and the body, and on the hands, and that its articulation points are very limited as well. I think that goes a lot further to describe what we're seeing. And so
It's a more,
To develop my point is that to develop in aesthetics, you've got to be able to describe what the hell you're talking about.
right. And
And so I try to come up with that system.
yeah, it sounds like you're arguing for a more nuanced and complex understanding of what the puppets actually do and how they're constructed, and how they're controlled, which puppeteers, we ourselves have to deal with all the time, but it might not be apparent from the outside that these kind of issues you're talking about. So I'm thinking like these insights probably come from your own experience as a puppeteer working in different forms.
Yeah, I've never been a builder or a designer. I mean,
Right.
when the companies I've worked with had to do some building, I was the guy that wrapped electric tape around the rods, because
Right.
any idiot could do it, and I was the idiot. But when you're performing, you know this, and probably most of the people watching know this, you've got to pay attention to these details.
Right.
And
Exactly.
they might not be, for someone who's strictly a scholar, they might not be something that's evident, like something like articulation points.
Right.
But if you've ever built a marionette, you know damn well, you've got to figure out, how am I going to bend the arms?
Mm-hmm.
Am I going to bend the arms? Am I just going to use a spongy material at the elbow?
Right.
Am I going to use something good? Am I going to put another articulation point at the wrist so I can do something
Right.
like this?
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, is try a more nuanced and fully articulated descriptive vocabulary, I guess, is what I was trying to come up with.
One of the things I think about along these lines is that, thinking of the first clip you showed of the foam rubber puppet, and then the Sicilian puppets and the Royal Deluxe puppets we've been looking at, is that those structural givens might not necessarily need to be considered as limitations. Like the fact that the Sicilian puppets don't bend their knees, or like, that's not necessarily like
I'm not
problem. Yeah, no, you're not saying that. I think I'm just pointing out, like,
yeah, you're quite right.
And
look, the aesthetic, to go back to that word, of the Sicilian puppets, you don't look at it and go, oh, that's lousy puppetry because the knees don't bend.
Right.
You have to take it on its own terms.
Right.
This is the way the puppets are designed and have been designed for, I don't know, 150 years or so.
Right.
And the question is, how do the puppeteers make the most out of it?
Right.
And I'm sure there's, good puppeteers and not so good puppeteers in that tradition. But I personally wouldn't claim to know what the criteria are for good or bad.
You talk about bad puppetry or lazy puppetry. Like, is that something to explore a little bit? I don't know if there's, I don't think you're showing examples of bad puppetry, but
no, I'm not. When you were talking to, I think it was Petty Francis.
Yeah.
You asked her how puppetry was in London when she first got there.
Right.
And she said something like, oh, it was terrible.
Right.
But people kept going to it, so people had no reason to improve. I think that's a paraphrase of what she said.
Sure.
And that's a problem, I think, because the puppet is inherently appealing.
Okay.
As a object / life.
Right.
You can get away with doing lousy shows.
Right.
I have. I'm sure you have. Well, not you, of course, but I certainly have. Not with any of the companies I mentioned, though, but with other companies. And for most people, it's enough that even if the show is not terribly well written, even if the manipulation is, sloppy,
yeah,
even if the puppets are rudimentary,
yeah,
that it'll still sort of work.
I think because of what you were talking about earlier, this sort of like amazing life, death, the dead things alive. I mean, the double vision can go a long ways, but
Well, that's the point.
yeah,
And so I think one of the challenges for puppet artists is not to settle for good enough, because good enough is easy
right,
with puppets. I mean, especially if you're doing shows for kids.
right,
Well, everyone who's watching this has seen some really, really miserable things,
right,
and has seen an audience respond perfectly, of kids respond perfectly well to it. And it's frustrating because you wonder why bother putting the effort into doing something good. And so it becomes more of a personal artistic challenge for puppet artists not
right.
to give in to the easy.
Yeah. Do you
And
think that challenge is particular for puppetry? Like, as a dancer or an actor or a musician, can you, get away with the equivalent of the lazy, look, I'm playing music, look, I'm dancing, and it's not, or is this particular to puppet theater in the West?
good question. Not so much in the West, I think everywhere, but I do think it's something that's, if not particular to, then particularly significant in puppetry. I mean, you hear a bad musician on the street,
Yeah.
Somebody playing guitar or something, like I used to do when I was in London, and I was busking, and they would like give me money just to make me shut up. I mean, you don't want to hear it. You don't stop and listen if you don't like the music, right? Bad music, even if it's a kind of music you like, is annoying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think bad acting
Mm-hmm.
is almost as annoying.
Mm-hmm.
But with puppets, there's an appeal that goes beyond the quality.
Right.
And that's at once the strength and
Right.
the weakness of puppetry.
Okay.
Because puppetry is created essentially in the audience's mind, it pulls the audience in.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really easy to get away with crap in a way that you couldn't do it. And I mean, to get hired doing terrible shows in a way that you would not expect a band, an orchestra, or an acting company to be able to get away with doing miserable work. But in puppet theater, as Penny Francis was saying, it is possible.
Right. I think to look on it in a more maybe a naive or more positive way, like it seems to me also, in thinking again of the ritual functions of puppetry, that it's sometimes that's enough, like what you want from the object in a ritual or a simplistic showing is, just that presence, and you're not wanting it to be a complete theatrical experience, but you're wanting it to preside over your circumcision ceremony or your Katagos in Turkey, but or over your funeral or wedding or coming of age ceremony. It's maybe that's a question of the theatrical aspect of it. Sometimes it's not really a full-bodied theatrical production, but something that gets at the magic of this double vision thing.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to look at it. It just maybe because puppets are often used in situations where one doesn't expect a high quality performance.
Yeah.
And puppets can get away with it. There's less incentive to push beyond that level of work.
Yeah.
And
Maybe.
people can become habituated to that level of work. You've never been in, I'm sure, but you probably know of people who've been in lousy puppet shows and like shrug their shoulders.
Uh, yeah. I think maybe that's also why something I see in puppet criticism or puppet reviews is like, wow, you're not going to believe this. I saw a puppet show, but it wasn't for kids. And actually it was really amazing because blah, 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 like their expectations are low. And then they're sort of surprised to see that actually something really great can happen.
Well, I think this was Penny's point, is that expectations get set so low that one has the performers have little incentive to make the effort to do better. And I think one of the beauties of puppetry in the last, I don't know, 60, 80 years, maybe 100 years, but certainly in the United States in the last 30 or 40 years, is you're getting a lot more puppeteers saying, wait a second, you know, good enough isn't good enough.
Right.
And we want to make theater. And part of that, I mean, you can do that certainly for kids shows. And I think most of the shows that I've performed in, I'm thinking especially with Bart, I mean, they were good shows. Right. They were effective, good shows. But the desire to move beyond that and actually reach adults, because there is this disinclination on the part of adults to participate as theater audiences with puppets, right? I think the challenge of doing good adult shows in this country is significant and drives performers to be better.
I'm thinking, yeah, I think that's true. It's an aspect of a lot of the recent work, as you're saying, in the past few decades. I think the level of artistry has gone higher.
Absolutely.
We have about a little less than a half hour left here, and I'm wondering what you'd like to do. There's a bunch of very interesting comments and questions here. A number of thank yous for your book because it was so integral in someone's dissertation, which is cool. One of the things I wonder about is your expansion of the area you're covering. In the essay I mentioned earlier, The Art of Puppetry in the Age of Media Production, where you went into film and video performance. And I'm thinking of Colette Searles, who teaches at University of Maryland. She says, could Steve speak to puppetry in film, translating this idea from live theater about puppetry only existing in the imagination to how we see it in recorded media? And she also says later on, can we get away with crap in film puppetry as well? So maybe that's a way to think about the age of media production and puppetry.
Excuse me. To the first part of your question about puppetry and recorded media, there's two different things that you can talk about. The first is regular puppet performance that happens to be recorded. So think about the Muppet movies for an obvious example.
Right.
Now, obviously, you know, the particular scenes are staged because in the way they're staged, because they're going to be filmed, and the camera angles and, you know, all the lighting and all that other stuff. And it's not actually a staged performance. But the point is, it's a real puppet, as it were, a tangible thing.
Right.
Being operated in the same manner as it would be if it were live on the stage.
Right.
That's one way. The second way is puppetry that's made possible only because of the media.
Okay.
And the classic example of that would be stop action puppetry, stop motion puppetry.
Right.
Which only exists through a trick. Trick is the wrong word, but through the process of the media.
Right.
Right. There's no such thing as stop action puppetry without film.
Right.
And so along those lines, you've also got puppetry or something that's like puppetry.
Yeah.
Steve Kaplan called it virtual puppetry.
Right.
Something that only exists through electronical media.
Right.
I'm thinking now of stuff like the Pixar films,
Right.
right? The characters in the Pixar films, which are moved, as it were, like puppets,
Right.
and which also serve to create a sense of double vision, like
Okay.
puppets. Elise, if you could run the Pixar trailers piece, that'll show what I mean.
Great. That's interesting that I'm interested to see how you talk about the double vision with these digital figures from Pixar.
And
Every year, grandkids, cousins, pretty much everyone gets together. Even great grandma Coco. And the winner is.
you can pull the volume down, please.
I tell her pretty much everything. I used to run like this, but now I run like this. It's just
Thank you.
faster.
The way the figures are designed, they're all, I mean, look at the woman's face, old woman's face. They're all exaggerated and they look object-like. Look at the skin coloring, the style of the skin. Everything could be done here, could be done in a sense with a real, that is a tangible physical puppet. But the freedom that is allowed by creating these puppets or these figures by CGI is very, gives you a lot of options. You can do all sorts of things that would take a lot of work to do with real puppets. But they're created either through, through one or another mechanism that gives the artist the control over the movement. And they create this sense of, well, I don't think, there's no way you think that's real. There's no way that image is alive, but it certainly gives a strong illusion of being alive.
Okay.
And so it's created sort of like a puppet, and the effect on the audience is sort of puppet-like.
Okay.
And so Steve Kaplan's point was that this sort of thing would be virtual puppets.
Right.
All right, you can stop that now, Elise, please. Thank you. And so to go back and just get to the point that I was making, the first way of doing recorded media with puppets is with the tangible puppets, the Muppet movies.
Right.
The second way is being something that is made only possible through the media, such as stop action and these CGI characters.
Okay.
Okay. So that's the argument, is you've got real puppetry and you've got essentially a virtual form of puppetry. Right.
And then what about Colette says, can you get away with crap? Just depend upon the fascination of the double vision in film puppetry as well as you can with live puppetry?
Well, I hate being quoted as having been so dismissive. I don't know. I don't know, because there hasn't been that much that's really bad. I mean, Pixar hasn't made a bad movie yet. You think about it, so much money goes into those things that there really hasn't been anything awful. But I'll bet you can. I'll bet it works the same way. Maybe you or somebody else has seen a really bad piece that still, has that effect. I don't know.
I don't know about bad and good. I'm thinking of like video games, and what do they call it? 8-bit, the early video games were like Super Mario Brothers or something, where the images are not really high res and they're just going flat across the screen, and they jump over this, and like it's not, now video games are extraordinarily realistic. Yeah. But back then it seemed, I'm not a player of video games, but it seemed to me that people would really get into those little digital figures that, were pretty funky and basic. I don't know if that's
I
an
think
analog.
that's a good point. Video games, I think, was one of the things that Steve Kaplan specifically mentioned,
Right.
if I remember correctly. And yeah. And again, those are figures that are just possible through the media. Now the video games, obviously, the graphics have gotten incredibly intense,
Right.
which raises actually one of the problems with what I wrote about CGI.
Okay.
Which is, sure, with Toy Story and the other Pixar movies, it's easy to see those characters as puppet-like.
Okay.
But what happens when CGI characters are created not to be puppet-like, but are created to be lifelike?
Right.
That's
Sure.
not something Steve addressed. That's not something I addressed.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think as computer graphics has developed over the years, it becomes it exposes a flaw in the argument that I made.
Okay.
For example, Elise, if you could put up how Hollywood makes crowd scenes, I'd appreciate it. And when we see this, we'll see.
Keep the volume low, I would say.
You
Super
keep the volume
low.
off.
Or off. Keep
You
the
can keep
volume
it
off.
on this.
Thank you. Excuse me, I interrupted you.
All of these are computer figures.
Right.
But is there any, and they're operated in the same way the computer figures are operated, the Toy Story figures are operated. Each one's manipulated. But, and again, I would hate to call any of this puppetry.
Uh-huh.
There's no sense of double vision involved in this. The purpose of all of these crowd scenes is simply to put one over on the viewer and make the viewer think that there's actually 100,000 people standing there.
But when I see like this scene from Lord of the Rings,
right?
Like I know they did not have 7,000 people do like it's it's digital animation, and aren't you also saying like, wow, that's really good digital animation? Or like with this what do you call it? I don't know, I haven't seen that one. But don't we still have a sophisticated understanding of it?
Yeah. You can stop it now, Elise. Thank you. Yeah, we, as sophisticated consumers of contemporary film, know that the crowd scenes are mostly computer graphics. But if I asked you to tell me which part of the crowd scene is live and which part of the crowd scene is computer graphic, you probably couldn't do it. Right?
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
In other words, we view the computer graphics in crowd scenes in the same way that we view live characters in the crowd scenes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In other words, we have been conned. I got nothing against being conned.
Yeah,
the medicine show with which we started the whole thing was a con. So I mean, I have a warm part in my heart for cons.
Right. Yeah. There's a certain degree to which you enter into being conned, I think. Like,
oh yeah,
you realize, especially in the 20th century, that Dr. Edison's electric elixir is probably not actually going to do what it says, but you love the speech and the patter. So is there?
Yeah, I think that applies in both cases. We want that to be a crowd scene.
Yeah.
I wouldn't use Coleridge's willing suspension of disbelief. I'd say it's a willingness to believe.
Yeah.
For the sake of a willingness to believe, tentatively, willingness to believe for the moment.
Yeah.
To be able to enter into the game.
Yeah.
And I think that works both with the medicine show and with this. Although there were people that actually bought the medicine hoping to be cured of one or another illness. We know that for a fact.
I wondered if in the remaining moments we have, like, we could talk a little bit about acting. Carol Sterling says, Steve, did your research reveal that people who are actors first often move into the puppetry world, or did your research reveal that people who are attracted to puppetry first learn more about building first and then learning about bringing a character alive? I guess that's not really about acting, but it's an interesting question.
I didn't do research into particular performance companies or forms of puppet theater, or I didn't try to analyze that particular issue. So I can't give a proper answer to it, but I can say that in my experience, most of the people running puppet companies begin as builders. I don't know if that's your experience, John, or
not so
building.
much.
Building is, you know, and then it's like, well, okay, now I gotta perform, but even worse, I gotta write a script.
Right.
Whereas there are some people that come into it as performers. For example, I came into it as a performer.
Right.
Me
too.
But I'm sure there are many people that, especially the people that end up running their own companies,
right,
you know, are builders primarily. Something that I argued years ago at a puppet conference in Vancouver, I guess, long time ago, was that the next major step for puppetry in this country is specialization. Let the builders build.
Yeah.
Let the performers perform. Let the writers write. Let the designers design.
Right.
Don't try doing everything yourself.
Right. I already feel that in companies I've worked with, like some people are more into the performing. Some people, I mean, everybody does everything in puppetry, but some people are real good builders. Like Stephen Kaplan is a really brilliant designer and builder. Some people are focused on writing, some performance, some movement. I don't know. I think some of that's happening already.
Yeah, well, it's been that conference was 30 years ago, and it's been happening incrementally. I think probably beginning even slightly before that. But I think that for puppetry, especially in the United States, I can't speak for elsewhere, but for puppetry in the United States, to be able to perform for adults, the separation of roles is important. And look, you get stuff like War Horse, which was on Broadway, okay?
Right.
You get stuff like Julie Taymor's stuff.
Right.
Okay, the Lion King. You get stuff like, what was that pornographic Sesame Street knockoff?
Avenue Q.
Avenue Q, which I loved.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. You look at things like these and you're seeing the specialization of performers performing, builders building, and writers writing. And I think that's if you're gonna find adult audiences, and all those shows did, you've got to allow people to do what they do best.
A sort of specialization. I'm thinking. Think of another question that Carol Sterling offers about education. Are you currently teaching on the university level? If so, where? Also, do you see an increased interest in courses about puppetry in theater departments on a university level in the US?
All right, where am I teaching? What was the first part of that question?
Are you currently teaching?
I teach at St. Mary's College of California. I do not teach in the theater department.
Okay.
And the research I was doing on world theater over the last few years had me looking at websites of theater programs at colleges all across the country.
Right.
And so I got a sense of what they teach.
Right.
And there are a handful of places that I noticed teaching puppetry.
Right.
But
and some of those people are our audience right now.
I suspect that most of those, that most of our audience is those people.
I don't know.
I don't think that there's a whole lot of places.
Yeah.
They might be rolled into some other course, but in terms of, a class on puppetry,
Right.
If 5% of the schools did, I think that would be a lot.
I think that's it. That's a cue for me to mention the puppet arts program at the University of Connecticut. Absolutely. In part, where we do have Matthew Cohen and Bart Rocco-Burton, as you mentioned, and myself and Paul Spirito and also and other people teaching puppetry. Okay, great. Claudia Orenstein, speaking of teachers of puppetry, says a little bit different area. So are you saying you are defining puppetry as located in the spectator? Only puppetry when the spectator sees a double vision?
Yeah, I would go that far. I mean, like I said, if you look at a puppet that's just laying on the ground or sitting on a table, we dignify it with the title of puppet.
Right.
But it's not alive. There's no double vision happening. There's no sense of animation in it.
Right.
Think back to the puppet thing we saw with the two pieces of foam and
rubber,
and the ball on top.
Right.
You would not want to call that a puppet if it wasn't there. You just saw a couple of glued pieces
right.
of foam.
Right.
And so, yeah, I would say that it's the audience that creates the puppet.
Okay. Great.
That creation is stimulated, obviously, by what the performer does.
Right.
But it's only in the vision of the audience that the puppet is created, is the claim I would make.
I wanted to think about your other work. You've written Rethinking Folk Drama, and then this new book coming out, The Challenge of World Theater History. And please let us know when it's coming out and how people can get it. But how has that work, your study of folk drama and world theater history, has that been influenced by your work on puppetry, specifically or indirectly?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's essentially a sort of mission creep. I wrote about puppetry, and in writing about puppetry, I read about a lot of folk theater.
Right.
And then I thought, well, I started reading about folk theater, and I realized there was not a whole lot of good writing on it. And I thought, well, I'll write about folk theater. So that was my dissertation. And then when writing about folk theater, I made a point of, in all of these works, of trying to be as worldwide as possible.
Right.
And when writing about folk theater, the question arose about how folk theater fits into the larger picture of theater. And so the mission creeped the next step into the entire issue of world theater.
Right.
And the new book, The Challenge of World Theater History, is being published by Palgrave Macmillan. I think you had a book by them.
Yep. Great.
And will be available, they tell me, in October.
Great.
Their puppetry plays a role in it. For some reason, a lot of shadow puppetry gets discussed.
There's a lot of shadow puppetry around.
A lot of shadow puppetry. I hadn't expected it to, but there's a pretty, Karagos is one of the things that I talk about a lot for one chapter, and the Indonesian stuff, of course,
right,
gets discussed. So there's a fair amount of puppetry in it, because I know one of your previous viewers, conversations, the participant was saying there's a question about of the relationship of puppetry and theater.
Uh-huh.
Right. And in my mind, no. puppetry is just one way of creating theater.
Yeah.
But there's no opposition, fundamental opposition between puppetry and theater.
Yeah.
You look at Japan with bunraku and kabuki,
Right.
same place. They have the same style of costuming. They have the same style of movement. They have the same type of speech.
Right.
One's using puppets and the other's using live actors.
Exactly.
How can you call one theater and the other some other thing?
Right. Yeah, that's wonderful. I really look forward to seeing the challenge of world theater history, because, you know, as someone who at an earlier point taught, you know, 2-semester world theater history classes with the you know, the sort of archetypal books in that area, Oscar Brockett, etc. It was super hard to sort of figure out when and how I could talk about puppetry, because it wasn't really a subject. So I look forward to a point of view that, as you just said, welcomes or assumes that puppetry is a form of theater. You know, that would be a great advance.
Well, I mean, you know, the traditional stuff in this country, certainly, and I think in other places in Europe too, is profoundly ethnocentric.
Yeah.
I mean, it might, I mean, some of the programs, you know, will the description will be, and Japanese theater will be considered too.
Right.
And that allows them to call it world theater.
Okay.
That's crap. You know that. It's, you know, 95% the same old stuff.
Right.
And a little bit of tokenism tagged onto it.
Right.
And it still leaves out Africa and China and, you know, India. And so what the book is trying to do is establish the basis for a new way of looking at world theater history.
Very good.
And it's essentially the anti-Brockett.
Okay. Very much needed. Very much needed. I think we're pretty much at the end of our time here, which has flown really fast because you've been such a brilliant and exciting speaker about your work, and we've had such great responses from the audience so far. I wanted to think or to ask Elise. Elise, maybe you could share in the Facebook column the links to the videos that Steve has shared with us. And there were some questions that people had that we didn't get to. So I don't know if Steve's a Facebook person, but maybe those could be answered later.
Will I have access to these questions? At least, will I have access to these questions after this discussion is over?
Yeah. Are you on Facebook at all? Yes. Lee says yes. Facebook. Okay. Yes, you'll have access. So
okay, I'll put them, copy them and paste them somewhere.
Okay. And then we can share them on this Facebook chat, which will be online, and people can watch this, I think, as you have, online on Facebook or on our YouTube channel. So that'll be awesome. I interrupted you.
No, I'm just trying to figure out a way that I can respond and say hello to everybody.
Yeah. Well, maybe we need a peroration from you, your final brilliant thoughts about, or not brilliant thoughts, half-assed thoughts, no, about puppetry.
That's mostly what you're going to get. I don't have a brilliant peroration. All I can say is what puppetry gives you is the chance to do what you want, creative freedom. You're not bound by the physiognomy of a body. You're not bound by gravity. You can create visions of any sort. For those who will look online, if at least you can put in all of the videos that I sent you, take a look if you want to see what freedom looks like at the Philippe Gentil videos that will be posted. There are sections, just small sections within each that are puppetry, but even those sections show you just how much freedom you have as a creator. And so, I mean, my peroration is simply think big.
Great.
Feel free.
Thank you, Steve Tillis. I would I would love to chat further with you. I really appreciate your taking part in this. It's wonderful to connect with you, you know, as a human being, despite the digital nature of this. After, you know, I and so many of the people here, we've, you know, read your book and appreciated all its insights, and look forward to reading your other works. I wanted to mention that next Thursday at 4 o'clock, our guest will be Frank Proshin, who actually posed an interesting question about Godzilla, I believe, earlier, which we didn't get to, whose special issue of Semiotica about puppets, masks, and performing objects appeared in a little before Steve's Towards an Aesthetics of the Puppet, but that'll be cool. Then Matthew Cohen, Raphael Fleury, and Dacia Posner will be our guests. Also tomorrow at 2 o'clock, Elise, who's been doing such wonderful work today, will do her edible puppets workshop straight from her kitchen.
Is that Oedipal, as in Oedipus?
We'll have to find out. We'll have to find. Maybe that's the double vision of that. So thank you, everyone, for watching this event. And we hope to see you at another event soon.
Thanks a lot, John. Thank you very much, Elise.